Good afternoon, and the Concord Bookshop. Even if you didn't know what it was called, you've almost certainly seen Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It's one of the most famous drawings in the world. In addition to the actual image, you've probably seen it as maybe a takeoff with a Guitar Hero, or in a vodka ad, or as Homer Simpson. But what is the origin of this? Starting with the Greek system of measurement based on the ideal human form, Toby Lester traces Vitruvian Man through the Greeks and the Romans, into the Middle Ages, up until Renaissance Florence. Along the way, you meet a cast of characters who have contributed to the Vitruvian Man, including, if you've read another recent book, The Swerve, Poggio Bracciolini, the scribe who discovered on the nature of things. He also shows up in this book. That's twice in 2 books, and somebody I had never heard of before, so this is quite interesting to me. Toby Lester is a contributing editor of The Atlantic, a former Peace Corps volunteer and UN observer. He lives with his family in Belmont. His previous book, The Fourth Part of the World, which we also have copies of here, was published in 2009, and so without further ado, Toby Lester.
So, yes, I've written a whole book about a picture, which was an interesting challenge. But this is the picture in the original right here. It's a picture that we all know, but what strikes me as kind of weird is that although everybody knows the picture, everybody's encountered it in some form or another, very few people can say that they know a whole lot about it. I got interested in it a couple of years ago when I was writing my first book, and as I looked into it, I realized there wasn't even a book about it. There wasn't a whole lot that I could find out about it, other than these kind of constant superficial references to it. In fact, what you encounter more often than the original are the knockoffs. You see them in serious forms like these. The image is used a lot to signify, the spirit of human endeavor, the high point of human culture, all sorts of things that sort of capture the nobility of the essence of what it is to be human. And then, of course, there are these things. Not only Homer, but SpongeBob. And you can find hundreds of them. It's everywhere. They recently constructed a giant Vitruvian Man in the Arctic as well, with half of him melting to show that we're, by warming up the planet, we're melting our own body of civilization, as it were. So it's interesting. But there are a lot of people also who will invest the picture with all sorts of Dan Brown-like codes, geometrical symbolism. Those are things that I don't believe Leonardo was investing in the picture. I don't talk about them in the book, and I sort of leave it to others to speculate about. I'm not really going to go into that a whole lot today, but I will go into the story of the picture, which, as you might expect, is a very visual story, and that's why I've got slides. The book is also full of illustrations. And it's worth keeping in mind that Leonardo obviously was a visual artist, but he was also a visual thinker. He really he thought by visual analogy, and he believed in the explanatory power of images. Images to him were better than words at capturing information, at compressing information, and conveying information. And that certainly holds true for this picture. What I do in the book is something that I'm going to try to just give you a superficial sense of today. Try to tell 2 stories. One is the story of Leonardo himself in the years leading up to 1490, when he's generally believed to have drawn the picture. That gives you Leonardo as he comes of age in Florence, and then it gives you about a decade of his time in Milan after he left Florence. But at the same time, this is a picture that actually is a play on ideas that are centuries and centuries old. And so in trying to get at the genesis of those ideas, I ended up going all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. And then the book sort of meanders through late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and right up into the Renaissance. And if I've done it right, they kind of converge, the story of Leonardo and the story of Vitruvian Man, and they bump into each other in 1490 when he draws the picture. So it's an interesting thing to think about. I first got interested in the picture. Oops. first got interested in the picture when I came across this map. My first book was all about early maps of the world. Turns out that this is not a strange, unusual medieval map. There are a number of maps and a number of images that are like this from the Middle Ages. And obviously there's a kind of eerie correspondence to Vitruvian Man. Here's a man with arms outstretched, standing in a circle in a square. This is a map of the world. East is at the top. This whole top half is Asia. This is Europe. This is Africa. But the point is that this Christ figure is doing double duty. His human body is literally embodying the earth, and his divine God the Father kind of existence is embracing the entire cosmos. So in very condensed form, what you've got here is a theory and an idea that predates Christianity, that dates back to the Greeks, known often as the theory of the microcosm. The idea that the human body itself is representative of something greater than itself, so it's sort of a mirror of the divine even. This was an idea that was very, very popular, not only in ancient times, but carried through in medieval times, in Jewish thought, Christian thought, Muslim thought. And it was really an engine not just of religious thinking and philosophical thinking, but also even scientific thinking. As I began to get interested in this, I looked into Leonardo's own writings and pretty quickly came across the fact that indeed he was aware of these ideas. He would have been very aware of them visually, but even in his notes, he has this to say, and he says other things like this as well. By the ancients, man has been termed a lesser world, and certainly use of this name is well bestowed because his body is an analog for the world. So there you've got Leonardo thinking in terms of the microcosm, and that made me think that in drawing this picture, he couldn't have just been drawing, somebody put it to me once, a naked guy doing jumping jacks. There's more going on here, and I wanted to see if I could get at least some of what might be in the picture. Before we start talking about the symbolism, though, let's just talk about the picture itself. It survives just as a single sheet of paper. Leonardo is very famous for having produced thousands of notebook pages. This doesn't survive in any of his notebooks. It's a little bit bigger than a piece of printer paper. I was lucky enough to go to Venice and have a look at it in the original. It's not on public display, but if you can get the right permissions, you can go see it. And I spent about an hour with the curator, and we looked up it close. The best part was holding it up, and you can actually see the pinpricks of light coming through where his compass point pricked the paper around the circle. All we have to go on, though, in starting to understand the picture is this one sheet of paper. There's the picture, obviously, which we'll talk about, but then there's also the text. The text is Leonardo's own handwriting, and it's done in his trademark right-to-left script. He reversed the letters themselves as well, so it wasn't just that he wrote right-to-left. Everything is sort of mirror image. And what that text talks about is Vitruvius, the architect, who laid out a series of human proportions. The proportions that Leonardo then goes on to delineate, you can find in this figure. But that obviously raises the question, who was Vitruvius? He was a Roman architect and military engineer. He lived in the 1st century BC. Initially, it seems that he worked under Julius Caesar on campaigns in Italy, in Gaul, basically tuning up the catapults and working on the siege engines, that kind of thing. But then later in his career, under Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, who was very interested in architecture and building Rome and rebuilding monuments and expanding the empire, Vitruvius sensed an opportunity. There were no treatises on architecture. So he decided he would write one, the very first one. He surveyed works of the ancient Greeks and picked bits and pieces of architectural knowledge from them and put them all in what he called 10 books on architecture. That book told you everything from how to mix mortar, to build walls, to choose temples. Vitruvius is the one actually who codified the orders that we talk about today, Ionic, Doric, Corinthian. In one of his books, the 3rd book, he had this to say about human proportions. No temple can be put together coherently without symmetry and proportion unless it conforms exactly to the principle relating the members of a well-shaped man. This requires a little bit of unpacking, but at a certain level, he's alluding to this idea of the microcosm that we were talking about earlier. you want your temple to be properly aligned with the heavens so that you can communicate with the gods. In order to have it be aligned with the heavens, you can observe the design of the human body and make sure that your temple corresponds to the proportions of the human body. Then everything is in alignment, and you've got, as one scholar put it to me, a hotline to the heavens. Everything is just lined up. So there's that element of thinking going on. But he's also got this kind of thing in mind. What you have to imagine is that this is not a work of art. This is a tool. There are a couple of these that survive from ancient Greece. And the idea is that if you're building a temple, you're probably going to be bringing in workers from different Greek islands, maybe even Egypt, Persia, a lot of different people who speak different languages, who certainly use different systems of measurement. Everybody had their own foot, their own systems with which to consistently measure things. You can't have all these workers with their own system building a single temple. This human body, a kind of ideal human body, is a way of making sure that everybody's using the same system of proportions. If it's an ideal human body, it's also aligned with the proportions and the sort of design principles of the entire universe, so you can make sure your temple really does what it's supposed to. This is a very compact way of conveying a lot of information. The foot there is to give you a sense of the size of a foot. You can obviously get the forefinger measurement, the inch, the thumb. This is a palm pressed into the arm, so you can understand the width of a palm. And then you've got the various different arm lengths. A cubit, fathom is the 2 arms all the way across. So you've got a lot of information packed into that image, consequently also packed into this image. Leonardo certainly is trying to compress information about human proportions and measurement right into this picture. But there's more obviously going on than that. In the same passage that he talks about temples in the human body, he then goes on to say, excuse me, that the human figure can be made to fit inside a circle. Take your compass and put one point in the navel and outstretch your arms and legs, and you can draw a circle around the body. By the same token, he says you can draw a square around the body if you put the arms out. He doesn't say that you superimpose them. He just says you can find those 2 shapes in the human body.
I noticed the square, his body is entirely in it.
Yeah.
Not in the circle.
Right, no, and we'll get to that because he actually came up with a solution that others hadn't been able to work out. Vitruvius didn't himself ever illustrate this. It's just a passage in his treatise on architecture. By alluding to the circle and the square, he's bringing up this idea of the microcosm again. I can't go into the details of it now. I do in the book. But let's just say that for shorthand, in a lot of ancient Greek thinking, ancient Roman thinking as well, the circle would connote the divine and the perfect. The circle is equidistant from the center at every single point. And the cosmos is designed as a series of concentric spheres in Greek thinking and Roman thinking as well. So the circle connotes the divine and the cosmic and the heavenly. The square, for its part, connotes the earthly and the human. And that kind of symbolism, Vitruvius is placing together in the human body. So the human body is the earthly and also the divine at the same time. Excuse me. This was a popular idea, and it outlasted the Greeks and the Romans. Like I said, Jewish and Muslim and Christian thinkers all absorbed it and made it their own. In the 7th century, a very influential encyclopedia writer named Isidore Seville summed it up this way: all things are contained in man, and in him exists the nature of all things. And then as the centuries go on, you see that idea elaborated on in all sorts of ways that, again, I go into the book and I can't really go into here except to show you just a couple of examples. Here you've got the human body just organized in terms of the 4 cardinal directions, which in effect is a circle and a square. The circle is the cosmic. The cardinal directions are how you square the horizon and make sense of it, bring it down to Earth. This is literally an image labeled the microcosm. Here it says the macrocosm consists of the 4 elements, so does the microcosm. This is a figure known as Zodiac Man, where the various body organs correspond to the constellations. And this is an image of the circular cosmos. All of these rings are the different planets and stars and moon and sun, with the Earth at the center. And the human body is embracing and simultaneous with all of it. So it's a very powerful idea. It affects medicine, because if your body is a mirror of the heavens, and in fact is influenced by the heavens. You can't do medicine without understanding astrology, and vice versa. If you're thinking about astrology, these things are too distant and too vast to fully contemplate, and yet you have a mirror of it in the body, and you can get a purchase on it by looking at the human body. So these ideas are very powerful, and they last well through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance until you get to Florence. Florence in the 15th century is where Leonardo enters the picture. He was born in 1452 and was a very precocious kid. We don't know a whole lot about exactly how he spent his childhood. He was born in a town called Vinci, not far from Florence. But he was precocious enough that when he was in his early teens, his father secured an apprenticeship for him with the master Andrea del Verrocchio, who ran an important studio in town. And Leonardo, in about 1466, moved to Florence and began working under Verrocchio and studying under Verrocchio. What would he have done as a young guy there? Menial things, of course. You're a new apprentice. You're going to be the one who gets sent out to do the errands and to sweep up. And he would learn how to mix paints and make glue. These things were not just sold in tubes. You had to do it all. He probably also would have modeled. By all accounts, he was a gorgeous-looking guy. And apprentices often were models in their own studios. It was a little closed community. And there's even a statue that survives from his early years with Verrocchio, by Verrocchio, that scholars think reflects the modeling of Leonardo. Who knows for sure, but I think for our purposes we can imagine Leonardo looking something like this as we go forward in this talk. So Leonardo would have studied painting, drawing, sculpture, all sorts of other things. And in addition to all of that, he would have studied human proportions. And in particular, he would have known some of the medieval manuals on art that addressed proportions very superficially, so superficially that one of them that I quote in the book dismisses women outright. It says, as for women, I'm not going to worry about it. They don't have proportions. I'm just going to go on and talk about men. So this entire conversation is happening talking about the human body as the male body, of course. In the second half of the 15th century, though, Leonardo would also have come across works by the great humanist scholar and theorist of art, Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote influentially on painting, on architecture. He was an expert on Vitruvius, but also on sculpture. And there's a lesser known today work called On Sculpture by Alberti that was influential for Leonardo. At the end of that work, Alberti said, okay, I've gone and I've studied a number of models who are generally considered to be beautiful. And I've kind of come up with an average of all their bodily proportions so that I can give you a picture of a kind of generic human ideal. And he listed a bunch of coordinates. It's sort of like a map of the human ideal. And then some of the manuscripts provide an illustration using all those proportions. And you get this kind of figure. At a very practical level, what he's doing is giving sculptors a tool. You're making your body. You want to make sure it's going to look right. So you can check your work and make sure that the distance from here to here corresponds to the distance from here to here, and the face has the appropriate divisions as Alberti and even Vitruvius have laid them out. So it's again another practical tool. But this is the second half of the 15th century in Florence. Plato is on the rise, and these ideas that the forms on the earth are just a sort of shadow of the divine forms. And if Alberti is trying to get at the kind of ideal version of the human body, he's alluding to something more than just this practical way of understanding the body. He's trying to get at something almost cosmic. He suggests that in another work he wrote about the same time, when he wrote, "In studying the limits of the human bodies, you can see more than all of your stargazing philosophers put together." Again, we were sort of yoking these ideas of the heavens and the body together. If you can really study and understand the human body more precisely than anybody has before, you're actually not just going to be doing art, you're going to be doing philosophy and science. And that's an idea that Leonardo absorbed powerfully. He was a very quick study. By the late 1470s, he struck out on his own and very quickly branched out. He wasn't just going to be a run-of-the-mill painter and sculptor doing work on commission for rich patrons. He just got too interested in everything. And among the many, many things he got interested in were engineering and architecture. And he certainly would have come across the works of somebody named Tacola, in Florence. Taccola was a very well-known architect and engineer who was active in the first half of the century. He was from Siena, nearby. He was a friend of Brunelleschi's, a very influential figure, and he did a lot of what Leonardo is famous for. He was constantly coming up with schemes for new kinds of weapons, ways to move rivers, all sorts of kind of fanciful sketches and drawings, including one that pertains to the story here tonight, this one. This is a vision of the microcosm. What he has to say in the text below is, I have all measure within me, what is heavenly above and what is earthly and infernal, and he who understands himself understands much. So he's working in this now age-old tradition of understanding the human body as the microcosm. What's interesting, though, is he's clearly now alluding to Vitruvius. He's not exactly trying to work out what Vitruvius said, because Vitruvius said the square would fit around the entire body and the arms would be outstretched. But Vitruvius is in the air, and that in fact is true. Vitruvius had survived in manuscript form for hundreds of years because the work had been copied by monks. But the monks really were only interested in the work because it had a few places where you could contemplate the divine through geometry and this kind of symbolism of the circle and square and so on. They didn't care about and didn't really understand all of the arcane architectural terminology and all of the Greek. And in fact, a lot of the Vitruvius manuscripts made people throw up their hands because the monks for centuries had been copying the Greek without understanding Greek and just garbled it successively with each copying. So it was a very hard manuscript to understand. In 15th century Florence, however, there was a revival in the first half of the century. A lot of people were interested in rebuilding Florence, in learning how the ancients had built their temples and their monuments. And there was only one manual that survived, and it was Vitruvius's. So he was really a sort of key to these aspirations that were now emerging in Florence to make Florence a new Rome, to make Italy a new Rome. And so this is kind of evidence that Vitruvius is now kind of being breathed in the atmosphere, and certainly Leonardo, in doing his work in Florence, would have been taking that in as well. For reasons that I go into the book and that I'm not going to go into now, things go sour for Leonardo in Florence, and he ends up not being that happy a person by the end of his time there, and he moves to Milan in about 1481. Very different place. Florence was a republic. Milan was a monarchy run by a self-proclaimed duke who, as the 1480s progressed, got very, very interested in rebuilding Milan and rivaling Florence in terms of its architectural glory. And one of his main projects right here at the center of town was the Cathedral of Florence. And he decided in the late 1480s he was going to have a competition, very much like the competition that had happened in Florence decades earlier, when Brunelleschi had entered and won and had then built the dome on top of the Florence Cathedral. This cathedral was yet still in need of a dome, and the Duke said, okay, send in your submissions. Leonardo decided he was going to do that. I think probably very much imagining that he could become a kind of latter-day Brunelleschi for Milan. And in his notebooks, you start to see him sketching doodles, plans for the Cathedral of Milan. So he's thinking about architecture, about domes, but he's also thinking about the human body. He's thinking about the microcosm. All these things are kind of spilling around in his head. The natural person, as he got more and more interested in architecture, for him to consult would be Vitruvius. But Leonardo was not a formally educated guy and actually had very weak Latin. So, and then of course Vitruvius was ferociously difficult anyway because the language was so garbled and arcane. So he really didn't have access to Vitruvius in the original. Fortunately, in the late 1470s, there was another very famous architect named Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who apparently had studied with Taccola, who was the author of that first proto-Vitruvian Man. Francesco decided he was going to just take the bull by the horns and see what he could do translating Vitruvius. And in fact, over the course of several years, really worked at producing one. While he was doing that, he also produced his own treatise on architecture and borrowed a lot of Vitruvian concepts and illustrated them. And what you see in his work, powerfully, again and again, is this idea of the human body as the design principle for architecture. Here we've got a church plan corresponding to the human form. not only, it's not just a human body though. At the beginning of this treatise, he illustrates Vitruvian Man. It's the same figure, and this figure in a kind of ghostly reincarnation just appears again and again inside all of these buildings. So I think this is generally considered to be the very first attempt to work out how you can fit Vitruvian Man in a circle and a square. He didn't try very hard, and in fact the navel isn't at the center of the circle. That's sort of the starting point for Vitruvius. He doesn't figure that out because it's very hard to put a circle inside a square and a body inside a circle and a square and make it work. For him it wasn't so important though. He wanted to just convey the idea visually. And again, he's working in the tradition of identifying the body as the microcosm. Man called the little world contains in himself all the perfections of the entire cosmos. Excuse me. So Leonardo, at the same time, sorry, one more slide. Francesco di Giorgio didn't just put the human body in large church plans. He put it everywhere. And it's a fascinating thing to go through his manuscripts and see how he tried to make every element of the building of churches, for example, correspond to proportions of the human body, really taking Vitruvius at his word. Leonardo, too, in the 1480s, was doing similar things. Leonardo was getting very interested in architecture and anatomy and human proportions, and you see him again and again sort of bringing these two things together. Here he's exploring the spine and the skull and sort of how they're coming together, and columns and capitals and how they come together, and the likenesses potentially between them. You see him in 1489, the year before he draws Vitruvian Man, exploring the interior spaces, the domed interior spaces of the church, the domed interior spaces of the body, using the same kinds of techniques to figure out what the design proportions are that will best hold them together. This again is another part of the story that I can't go into in detail now, but I do in the book. It's really interesting, and let's just suffice it to say that this picture in particular is not just a drawing of anatomy. It's Leonardo trying to work out the exact coordinates of the seat of the human soul, which he puts right there. It has to do with medieval brain theory and a whole lot of other things. But for now, let's just say that the important thing is that proportions are the key. Proportions are really going to get you a lot of information. And so he, like Alberti before him, launches this extensive study of human proportions. He also seeks out a number of models, draws them, measures very specifically, the distance from the cartilage at the bottom of the nose to the top of the lip, and compares that to parts of the ear. And you see lots of sketches like these. He's trying again, like Alberti, to build this single map of the human ideal. And here it is. You can see in 1489 he's kind of trending toward Vitruvian Man. Excuse me, but he's not quite there yet. In 1490, the year that he's supposed to have drawn Vitruvian Man, the Duke of Milan invites Francesco to come to Milan to judge the contest for the dome of the Cathedral of Milan. Francesco chooses somebody else, doesn't choose Leonardo's model, but the two of them are then sent by the Duke to go do an architectural project elsewhere, and they lodge together for a couple of days. So now we've got Leonardo and Francesco, both interested in exactly the same things, both artists and architects, and Leonardo desperate to find out more about architecture and Vitruvius, and lo and behold, he's got the one person who's translated Vitruvius and who's illustrated Vitruvian ideas right next to him. So you can imagine that he probably would have looked at that treatise, which it turns out Leonardo owned, and seeing that picture of Vitruvian Man, probably thought, I can do better, but we don't know. So there's a powerful influence on him, driving him to draw Vitruvian Man. There's one more element of that story. After he comes back from this consulting trip to Milan, he has dinner with an entirely forgotten figure named Giacomo Andrea, who's from Ferrara, who's an expert on Vitruvius, who's a very dear friend of his. In his notes, he makes that clear. And there's a new theory by a scholar named Claudio Scarbi that proposes that Leonardo and Giacomo Andrea, in fact, were trying to collaborate and produce the very first illustrated manuscript of Vitruvius. It makes a lot of sense. Vitruvius never illustrated his work. Giacomo Andrea was an expert in Vitruvius and a scholar and an architect. And Leonardo was the consummate illustrator for a project like this. So you can imagine how they would have complemented each other, especially if they were very good friends. And lo and behold, this scholar, Claudius Garbi, has unearthed a manuscript that he's attributed to Giacomo Andrea that dates to this period and that in fact contains an image that looks an awful lot like Vitruvian Man. This is the same figure, but it's also very different. Claudius Garbi's idea is that the two of them were probably working side by side, playing with these ideas. One of them came up with the idea of dropping the circle, dropping the square down so that it's not just inside the circle. That solves the problem of how to make the navel the center but keep the human proportions roughly proper. This image, Giacomo Andrea's image, tends toward depicting this figure as a kind of generic Christ-like figure. And of course, Leonardo, when he plays with his man, produces something much more individual. So that in a kind of very accelerated form traces a number of the influences that I talk about in the book, bringing you to Vitruvian Man. And I thought just for the final 5 minutes, I'd speculate a little bit on the reasons that he might have done the picture. There's no journal entry dated, August 22nd, today drew Vitruvian Man, it means this. So we just have to work with what we have and try to make sense of it. At one level, it is what it is. It's a study of human proportions. He lays out the proportions that Vitruvius set out, and then all of these lines on the picture are his efforts to make sure that he's doing exactly what those proportions say. He's measuring the distance from here to here, comparing it with the distance to here. Even this line on the hairline is very straight because Vitruvius divided the head and the face into 3 places. So that at one level is what's going on. It also explains something that really used to bother me about the picture, and that is this very unnatural bend of the foot at the bottom. I used to think, well, Leonardo was so good, he couldn't have made that gross an error. But it's not an error, it's deliberate. He's trying to show you what the width of a foot is, just like that stone ancient Greek relief shows you the foot at the top. You got to know the measurement, the system of measurements. Francesco di Giorgio did the same thing, but Leonardo was so interested in compressing information into a single image that he puts it in the picture. So the picture may have been intended as an illustration that would have accompanied maybe the first illustrated manuscript of Vitruvius. Or maybe Leonardo did it as a single sheet to dedicate to the Duke of Milan as a way of ingratiating himself with the Duke of Milan, who was so interested in architecture. There are other possibilities. He was immersed at this point in the study of the human anatomy, and he planned a book called On the Human Body. Maybe it was for that. He also planned a book called On Sculpture, very consciously modeling himself on Alberti. Alberti illustrated his ideal human figure. Maybe Leonardo was doing the same. There's even another possibility. It has to do with human motion. There are references from other people who talk about Leonardo's having written a book on human motion in the 1490s. This is a study of human motion, and people think about it as 2 poses. He's flapping his wings or doing jumping jacks or something. If you think about it, though, he's actually in 16 different poses. One arm up, one leg out. And in a way, it becomes a kind of weirdly good proto-animation. It's a kind of, he's a moving figure, constantly moving around in a time before cinema. As it turns out, in the 1560s, there's a manuscript that survives containing copies of drawings by Leonardo, and then some other pictures that don't have known copies. But the theory is that maybe these also reflect copies of Vitruvian Men that Leonardo produced. Maybe he did a whole series of moving Vitruvian Men, and that initial image that we know was part of that series. Who knows? It's just impossible to say. The fun thing about this idea of motion is that it was very important to Leonardo. Capturing motion was not just a game. He believed that if you could capture motion, you're really capturing some kind of essence of life. Motion, in a way, was philosophy, and if you could get at, that's why, for example, all of his figures in the paintings even are looking off into the distance, or he's holding an animal that's wriggling away. Capturing motion is very important. Also explains why Disney in the heyday of animation tried to capture the idea of animation in a kind of Vitruvian mouse. It's very funny, but in fact they're getting at something that Leonardo was really, really serious about. Finally, there's one last thing to speculate about. We can't know for sure, but to me it seems like at some level, if not exactly literally, then at least metaphorically, this picture represents a kind of self-portrait. at the very basic level, it can't be too exact because he's basing this figure's proportions exactly on these Vitruvian proportions. So, and nobody corresponds to those. So this is an ideal figure. But in particular, what gets me is the face. The body is done finely but generically. The face is kind of handled differently. It feels very specific, and it's part of the picture's draw. Leonardo is described in the surviving descriptions of him as a very finely proportioned, beautiful-looking guy with curls that flowed down to his shoulders. It all sort of generally corresponds to this kind of image. Remember this idea of what he looked like as a young guy, not too different. There's actually a portrait of him, or at least it's believed to be a portrait of him that survives from the early 1490s when he was in Milan. This is by the architect Bramante, who is a very good friend of his as well. This portrait bears a certain likeness to that face as well. And I don't want to push this too far because it's impossible to know how close the resemblance is, if at all. But I do think that even if we're not talking too literally, there's a kind of way in which this picture is a study of Leonardo studying himself. Here's a guy who was just interested in everything, trying to figure everything out. And like Tacola in that early Vitruvian Man, he's got this idea that if he can understand himself, he can understand a lot about the world. That's the idea of the microcosm that pervades the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So what I see when I look at this face is the ghost of Leonardo looking out at me and all of us, but also Leonardo kind of looking into the mirror, looking at himself, trying to figure out himself, and trying to make sense of really a whole world. That's all for today. Thank you, though. Happy to chat as much as you'd like to chat about it.
The text. You speak of such a mystery that we have no idea what is being expressed in the picture, but what does that text say?
It says, literally, the architect Vitruvius, in his book on architecture, lays out these proportions. And then he goes on to say, well, you know, like from the hairline to the nose is equal from the nose to the chin. And it's just a list of those kinds of proportions, some of which actually are original to Vitruvius, some of which are not, and which clearly Leonardo interpolated from his own studies and put into this image. But that's all there is to this. There's nothing, it doesn't go beyond to say anything else.
What's on the other side?
Nothing.
Nothing's on the other
Nothing.
side.
Except some glue where it used to be stuck into somebody's collection of pictures.
Okay. And the title of the book, The Ghost. Who's the ghost?
Leonardo, staring out at us, Vitruvian Man, staring out at us.
Why did you pick that up?
It felt to me like this figure's everywhere. Leonardo's dead, but because the figure's everywhere, he's still alive. He's sort of haunting, you know, everything from coffee cups to Skylab.
You mentioned his writing right to left and letters perfectly reversed. Do we speculate he was dyslexic?
Did everybody hear that? The question is his writing and why he did that. Was he dyslexic? What was the reason? I've never heard the dyslexia theory. The most common theory is a really simple one. I mean, there are some theories that it's, you know, he was very interested in being secret. He didn't want anybody to understand his notebooks. And there was a certain culture of secrecy among engineers at the time. They didn't want people to get their ideas. But the much more likely explanation, I think, is simply that he was an unschooled boy. He taught himself, or was taught by, you know, sort of family and friends who were not very formal about it. And he was left-handed. So as he wrote with a left hand, when you're dipping a pen into ink, if you drag your palm across the ink, you're going to smudge it all. So he probably just started writing left-handed backwards. Because he was so gifted visually, he could just flip everything, and it became second nature. And by the time he actually was an adult having to produce things like this, he just did it that way. It was easier. I guess nobody really knows for sure, but that's the best explanation I've heard.
I noticed on one of the last drawings, the figure had his hands raised with the elbows bent. And I was trying to figure, and I could do this at home, if you raise those hands, if it would take into the circle to the top. You know, if these arms went up another degree or something, or even if they went up straight by the sides of his ears.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any. All I can say is that it looks. This image looks pretty close to Vitruvian Man, although it seems as though they started by putting the square all the way down to the bottom and then decided to have it come up here. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I like better to look at Leonardo's drawing, and like it would be very easy to fool with that with some tracing paper,
Yeah.
and get those proportions.
Yeah.
I had never thought of that until today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks for that.
Well, I just find the more you look at this picture, the more you can, especially if you start to immerse yourself in the ideas that were in the air in his time, the more there is there. Although it's all speculation at a certain level. He didn't say what he was investing in the picture.
If you do the face close up, it looks like the eyes aren't symmetrical. They're kind of, one's looking up, or one eyeball is not the same. The
Yeah, it
one
does.
on the left is,
Yeah.
I wonder.
Well, and that could be another little clue that he's actually basing it on a model, or it could just be the ravages of time. It's hard to know.
Or maybe there was some point in the proportion of an eyeball.
Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed in the original picture, maybe I'm not seeing it correctly, but isn't his foot shown sideways on
This
the
one?
right there?
Well,
And
it's
why is that at different sides of it sideways?
well, it's angled.
Is that-
Yeah, it's not fully
Well,
sideways.
I was just thinking if I turn my foot down.
Yeah, it's
the
hard.
same length.
It's hard to see, but if you zero in on it, it's here it's frontward. On the circle, it's like that, and then the sideways foot is like that. So you don't get a full sense of the size.
This page, the context, the papers that it was with, were there no revelations about this in terms of the other papers, the provenance of it?
So the story of the page itself is really hard to reconstruct. We know he drew it in about 1490. That's based on the handwriting style, the ink, the interest that he had at the time. It really does correspond very closely to things he was working on in 1490. But there's no natural place in any surviving notebook that it clearly would have come from. It's also done more finely than his notebook sketches. They tend to be fairly hastily done, and they're more like he's working things out. Here he's worked it out. So we don't really know. He drew the image. A few people admired it in his own time, and then it disappears for centuries. It's not like people smacked their foreheads and said, wow, let's make it an icon. It wasn't until the late 1700s that it reappears in the historical record in somebody's collection.
So was it recorded that it existed and then they couldn't?
Yeah, there's one reference from the 1530s or 40s saying, there's this fellow Leonardo who drew a picture studying human proportions, but that's it.
So it fell out of that collection,
Just
was
disappears.
adrift, and then found again.
And then it reappears in somebody's collection in 1770, gets printed a couple of times in books that don't have a wide distribution. It's actually only in 1956 that it gets published in a book on art history but called The Nude that was very, very famous, and that released it into popular culture, and so it's a very modern phenomenon, at least as we understand it.
Is that the Kevin?
Exactly,
Clark?
Kenneth Clark. Yep.
Civilization.
Yep. And I did you can do a search on Google. You can take a phrase and plug it in, and actually they've got a fair number of books that are scanned going even back to the 1500s. So if you do a search from 1500 to 2012 and you plug in Vitruvian Man, you get nothing, 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 and then 1956 or so it goes so you can see the spike.
I have that book, but to me, to hear that that
Yeah.
was
That seems to be the moment, as best I could reconstruct it. Yeah.
I may have missed it. Why is the title of the book
Da Vinci's Ghost.
Ghost? Ghost?
It just seemed to me that the picture it's everywhere, and it's a kind of self-portrait, at least in my contention. And so, even though Leonardo's dead, he's still alive, and he's everywhere, kind of a presence, looking back out at us from 500 years ago. All right, one more, yeah.
Could you talk about your research a little bit?
Sure. So I did. I'm lucky enough to have a wife who works at Harvard. So I used the Harvard library system a fair bit. I went to Venice to see the picture, and I'll tell you a very short story that wasn't funny at the time, but now is a good story to tell. it's actually very hard to get the authorities at this museum, it's the Accademia Gallery in Venice, to let you see the picture. So I had to go through many hoops, proving that I was legitimate, proving that I'd published. Eventually, they agreed to have me come. The curator doesn't really speak English. I don't really speak Italian, so that alone was a barrier. Finally, I had this email from her saying, 4 o'clock Thursday, come to the door of the gallery and I'll take you in and we'll look at it. So I made plans, booked a flight, go to Florence for a couple days, then go to Venice, and on my final day I go at the appointed time, and she's not there. Nobody there. And then I show them the email, and then there's a lot of head scratching and people wandering around and telephones, and eventually they get her on the phone, and she's on the other side of the city, and we're not able to communicate very well, but all I remember her saying is, no possible, no possible. So eventually I went over, found her, and to make a very long story short, she said that the government had decided that they wanted to restore the gallery. Everything that wasn't on public display had to be boxed up and put away, and so it was no possible, but she could have told me before I booked the ticket. And right when I left, she said, well, maybe next time. I went back, and in going back, I made another trip that involved successfully seeing the picture, but I also went to Windsor Castle in London that has a beautiful collection of Leonardo anatomical and proportional studies, and had an afternoon on my own with about 40 Leonardo pictures. Just, that was the research highlight of this book. I also I read a lot, and then I reach out to people whose work seems to be particularly relevant to me, and then I sort of correspond, talk to, meet people, and try to bounce my emerging theories off of them. That's pretty much the deal.
In the introduction to you here today, there was mention of the character, the person in the book titled The Swerve. But this is also a person or character in your story. Can you say something to that?
Sure. So his name is Poggio Bracciolini, and he actually appears in my first book as well. And at the end of the first book, when I was looking around for a new book to write, I had a thought, well, maybe I should write a book about him. And then I thought, no, nobody will ever buy that book. So, but he is a great character. The reason he figures into this story is that he, in the early 1400s, was very, very instrumental in traveling around and basically saving a lot of medieval manuscripts that were copies of ancient works that were sort of moldering away in libraries and probably would not have survived. He found these things and then had them copied, or possibly even stole them outright and brought them back to Florence, and helped engineer a lot of what we know of as the Renaissance. In The Swerve, he does that for Lucretius in his poem. In this case, he does it for Vitruvius. He found a full, beautiful Vitruvius manuscript, brings it back to Florence, and that's what kind of sparks the interest in Vitruvius in Florence. In the first book, he's also very, very interested in geography, and is reviving all sorts of ancient ideas about geography that help Florentines and ultimately Columbus and Vespucci and others make their voyages and think about geography in new ways. So he's a great figure that I wish I'd written a book about.
Well, you wrote this one.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, sure, one last one.
Was there anything that really surprised you in learning about Da Vinci, the man, that you didn't know before you started your research? What was that?
Well, everything about him that you hear tends to be right. I mean, his voraciousness for understanding and knowledge, you can't help but be just kind of bowled over by it. He just never stopped. But what really surprised me is how, in a lot of ways, he was weirdly medieval and derivative. He didn't just plop on the earth and transcend his time and see forward. He was very much a product of his own times, and a lot of what he did was backward looking, and he was blind to all sorts of things that we kind of forget about now, and as imperfect as we all are, and that we forget when we mythologize him. So I think that was probably the thing that surprised me most about it.